If you would have told me in 2006 that the Paris taxi industry, which has not had a single change since 1945, had a licensing structure that was set up in 1945 to protect the taxi industry. If you would have told me that and any effort to disrupt it didn't even get to first base. If you would have told me this would completely fall on its knees, protest with fires on the street, and the prime minister involved, and it would happen because of a college dropout who lives in California and doesn't speak a word of French, I would have told you were fucking crazy, and he did that in 2 years.
Welcome to the Early Podcast, where we interview the best and the brightest who've built the world's most innovative companies. Hosted by me, Max Crowley. Tune in weekly for new episodes, and please, please, please like, subscribe, and share. And now for today's episode. Let's go. Dan Gellman, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for joining.
The legend himself. What's up?
It's good to see you. Live from, where are you calling in from?
Calling from Colorado.
Very cool, very cool. I'm sure there's snow on the ground there.
There is. Yeah, they're opening the lift tomorrow. We'll see how that goes.
You graduated from Stanford without a job, but somehow still ended up at Goldman Sachs relatively quickly. How did you end up there?
So I did actually have a job, sort of. I was working at a family camp where the only staff were Stanford alumni. It's called Stanford Sierra Camp. And I was working there for the summer. That was my only plan in life when I graduated from college. There were all these Stanford alumni family that were coming to that camp. 3 or 4 weeks in, it just kind of hit me that there were all these super high power people around me that I could try to find a job from. So I worked my way into a conversation with this woman who was talking about her team at Goldman Sachs and how they lost their college analyst. He decided not to join. They were short an analyst. So I said, well, I'd be interested in interviewing, even though I knew nothing about, my dad was a stockbroker, but I knew nothing about finance. I didn't own a suit. But she introduced me to the team. So I drove out to San Francisco from Tahoe, and 3 interviews later. So, I had to go back and forth 3 times. I wore a friend's suit to the interviews. I ended up getting a job as a first-year analyst on a trading desk in San Francisco.
What were your other alternatives? So, what else could you have done at that time?
Oh man, this is kind of like a painful story, but the other role, Stanford was the 3rd school on Facebook. So once that happened, I just started networking like crazy and asking everyone I could find about jobs, and different stuff did kind of pop up. But one of the jobs I did kind of get in a conversation with was to be the first employee at Facebook on the West Coast. Basically, I have an interview, I have an email conversation I had with Dustin Moskovitz, who was one of the founders when he was at Harvard. It was from my email to his Harvard email address. And it was just a tab on the website that said jobs. And I was in this mode of trying to find a job. And he and I were going back and forth, but then they stopped responding. Then in October, he pinged me and he said, I know this is super late, but any chance you could meet us in Mountain View? And I ended up not going, even though, and I still remember where I was when I turned down that opportunity. It was because I was working at Goldman Sachs as someone who knew nothing about finance, and where this team took this bet on me. I went to work every day so nervous that the idea of making up an excuse to go interview with Facebook, it's hard to put in words how early it was though. It was literally there were no employees. This would have been the first person.
My friend, what year is this?
04. Yeah, the summer of 04. It was when they were all at Harvard. And my friend Ezra Callahan from Stanford got a job 4 months later, and he was a first 10 employee. So this was so early. And I still have that email where I was sorry, any chance I could recommend some friends to you? And I knew it was the wrong decision. When I turned it with people oh, you could have never known Facebook would be that big. I knew Facebook would be huge. You could tell from the first week as it was at Stanford. In my house at Stanford, there was an NBA player, a guy, not at the time, but a guy named Josh Childress, who ended up going to the NBA. All these guys, all the athletes, everybody, they were using Facebook. And people are oh, well, it could have been MySpace. No one was using MySpace. No one was using Friendster. No one was doing any of that stuff. But everybody, was just addicted to Facebook from day one. So that was I'd say it took me a good 7 years to get over. It didn't, I loved my life. I moved to Asia. I loved Goldman Sachs. I worked at Goldman Sachs for 8 years. But knowing I turned down an interview to be basically the first non-founder employee at Facebook was very hard for a little while.
What was that feeling? What were you getting over? What was in your head?
It's just this knowledge that I had this email chain with D. Moskovitz at fast.harvard.edu, where he's inviting me to be the first employee at Facebook. And instead I took an analyst job at Goldman Sachs, even though I knew it was the wrong decision. I worked for a guy named Ned Siegel, And Ned, basically, when I was at that summer camp and driving to San Francisco to interview, almost everyone was like, we can't hire this guy. Like, he knows nothing about finance. He doesn't know what stocks are. But this guy, Ned, was like, no, we're going to hire him. Like, I see something in this kid. And he pushed everyone else to hire me. And he really took a bet on me. And this is also actually, I always tell people this story. He took a big bet on me and really, I felt a lot of loyalty to him because he gave me a chance. And it was kind of like because of that I didn't do this interview. I was like, I couldn't tell Ned I'm like leaving. Even if I got a job, I couldn't, even though I knew it was a better opportunity, I couldn't leave. And Ned left the team 2 months later. I use that story just to tell people, don't be loyal to companies. Don't be loyal to people. Like, everyone's looking out for themselves. Companies are looking out for their shareholders. That's what should happen. That's like capitalism at work. Like, within these corporate structures, look out for yourself. That is a story I sometimes tell people. And Ned went on to be the CFO of Twitter. I mean, I still appreciate him immensely for the opportunity he gave me. That set everything in motion in my life. But
yeah, it was funny. I was talking to Ryan McKillen on the pod, and I said he didn't join Uber right away when he met Ryan Graves, and that was to be employee 2 or 3. And I said, why did you not? And it was, he felt a loyalty to the person who had hired him before. And then ironically enough, a month or 2 later, the company kind of went bust. And so he very quickly called Ryan Graves and said, check that. I do want that job. But it's another similar learning of loyalty early in your career. And it's really hard.
Yeah. It's just not worth it because everyone is, first of all, corporates don't care about you. Like, my career was 8 years at Goldman Sachs, 8 years at Goldman Sachs, 7 years at Uber. So I've worked at big companies. And at the end of the day, it's like Uber, we lost Travis. Uber didn't care about me at that point. Yeah, it's good to be loyal to individuals. The reason to stay at Uber wasn't because you feel loyalty to someone. It's because the opportunity was fantastic. And if that is not your impression, then do the thing that is best for you. Like, that is, that corporates are not emotional beings.
Well, how did you end up in Asia for Goldman Sachs?
So I was at Goldman for 2 years in San Francisco. And really good people, but I was 23. I just worked at a summer camp. I didn't own a suit 6 months earlier. I was like, this is not for me. But I stuck it out for 2 years. And I got to know one of the guys was coming through San Francisco. One of the guys who worked in Asia came through San Francisco. And I went to some meetings with him and we chatted for, a few hours, just driving we went to like Stanford for a meeting to talk to the endowment or something like that. And a month later, he pinged me, said, hey, I got an opening on my team. Would you want to come join? Like, I kind of want someone from the States. And I ended up becoming I ran a product about research options in Asia. So I became, my title was the head of derivative research for Asia, which was, again, I knew nothing about derivatives, knew nothing about research, and knew nothing about Asia. I'd never been to Asia before going. And now I have 3 Asian children. So yeah, funny how that works. But yeah, no, it was through that guy, and he's still a good friend of mine. I worked for him for 6 years, and most people leave Goldman and kind of roll their eyes when you ask about it. I loved it. I had a great experience. I thought it was tons of fun.
So why then did you end up thinking about leaving Goldman? And I know there was a bit of a lead up before the Uber interview process. You were looking at Airbnb, even may have interviewed with Brian Chesky. So yeah, why'd you decide then to pivot away from Goldman at that time? And what was kind of the lead up before you got in the mix with Uber?
So my job at Goldman was, at this point, was writing research reports. And just my personality is just not very good at writing research reports. So like in the early days, I would take like Adderall so I could get shit done. Then that was just like too much. So I would just start drinking coffee all the time. And like, I look at my peers, and my peers were just people like, who were just naturally good at sitting in cubes and writing research reports. That just was not me. So I loved the job because I got to travel and market and stuff, but the core of it was really hard. So I was still in good standing. I was a vice president. I was on the up and up, but I was just like, I can't like living off caffeine like this. I need to find something that's a bit better fit for my personality. And at that point, I'd been at the company for 8 years. So like moving back to the trading floor felt like it was tough. So I just decided to leave. And I started looking for startup jobs. It was just kind of, I think it was kind of that Facebook kind of thing that was nagging at me. I was like, all right, I've made enough money at Goldman for a single 29-year-old to get by. Like, I don't need to like keep climbing this ladder. Let's find something else. And I was a host for Airbnb. So, and Brian Chesky came to a tech conference in Hong Kong, like a really small one that a friend of mine interviewed him. So I kind of tracked him down afterwards, said I want to work for him. He gave me the contact information of some woman named Lisa, who I think was helping out with the international expansion. And I spent like 3 to 4 months trying to like kind of figure out a role that could have worked for me at Airbnb. But I I couldn't land one there. So then I basically went into full network mode again, started texting everyone I knew or Facebook messaging, being like, hey, trying to find something new. Do you know anything out there? And one of the people who I knew was Pachini, who she had been the secretary or the assistant for a client of mine at Goldman Sachs. And she was now Travis's secretary. Secretary is a word they use in Asia, but they don't use it in America. It's like not a word. So assistant. And I don't mean that in any negative way.
Executive assistant. Yeah.
Secretary is like totally status quo vocabulary in Asia, but it was not in the US. And I've never had an assistant myself. So for me, that is not.
And Pachini is one of the best people in the world.
She's amazing. Pachini's awesome. But she pinged me, or she was like, oh my gosh, you want to leave Goldman? You should come work at Uber. And obviously one, she loved the job. Two, those referral shares were freaking insane.
Yeah.
I mean,
make it rain.
That was huge for me, but it was also huge for her. And when she told me about that job, I actually was like, I'm not interested. I actually told her I wasn't interested because I'd never heard of Uber in my life. I don't personally like cars. I'm just like not a car guy. I drive a minivan. So I was like, this isn't for me. But then a month later, I kind of circled back and I was like, oh, I guess I'll interview. So that was kind of like how it all started.
And then I think there was a magical experience you had with Uber that was maybe sort of the aha moment. One of your colleagues mentioned it or something like that.
Oh, yeah. I still had no idea what Uber was basically, but it just, maybe I looked it up and I saw some people talking about it. So I was like, okay, like this feels like it has a little bit of buzz, but I went, so I was good. So Pachini connected me with, for interviews with Travis and Ryan. My only interviews were with Travis and Ryan Graves. And, the night before I was like, I just went out. I didn't think anything of it. Went out. I was grabbing a beer with a friend and he said, I was thinking about we should bring Uber to Hong Kong. And I was like, what? He's like, I'm actually talking to the CEO tomorrow. And he's like, oh my God. He was like in shock because he was like a bit of a Silicon Valley guy who lived in Asia, but who kind of followed tech. And he was like, wow. And I think it was I was like, oh, maybe I should take this a little bit more seriously. So I kind of went home that night and started like watching YouTube videos of Travis and like got to know his personality a little bit more. And, but it was a very real strength for me that I went into that interview with Travis and Ryan, like with no idea who they were really. Like I just was like, I still remember I saw some article that Airbnb invested in Uber. And I said to Travis, I said, in the interview, I said, oh, congratulations. I saw you guys got an investment in Airbnb. He said, why are you congratulating me? You should congratulate them. I said, well, I'm not on the phone with them. I'm on the phone with you. So I'm congratulating you. And I just had this like confidence that like I never had with Travis ever again. Like every other time I talk to Travis, I'm like, but like on that call, I was so confident. And I think that he liked that. I think that kind of like was appealing in a candidate.
Back to Airbnb. And again, I know that they came back around and maybe you could have ended up working there, but it is kind of wild that the companies for the most part were sort of similar time and place and really hired differently. Like it wasn't like there was cross collaboration. It wasn't that people flew, sort of went back and forth. They were really two different companies.
Yeah, I mean, I had this like idea back then that I could help with Asia expansion, which is exactly what Uber hired me for. But what Airbnb at that time had done, they hired some guy named Oliver Jung. He was a German guy, and he was a bit like Rocket Internet. So in that moment, Rocket Internet was creating all these Airbnb clones in like Latin America and Asia, and Airbnb USA. Like this was kind of the moment we were in was like all these US companies were springing up, like Groupon, Airbnb, Uber. And this was before like DoorDash and Lyft and some of those guys, but like it was kind of like the beginning of the gig work, whatever the word term was, the gig worker or whatever. And Rocket Internet was in the business of taking American companies and cloning them one for one in other countries. And Airbnb was like, oh, hell no, you're not going to do that to us. So they hired this other German guy to expand Airbnb as quickly as possible. So all my interviews were with him. It was very different from Uber, where my interviews were with, Airbnb was also 2 years older at the time or 1 year older. Like they were much more advanced at that point. So, with Uber, I was just lucky because I was, first probably 50 employee, whatever the number was, versus Airbnb probably had a few hundred people at that point. So they had already kind of like got these guys.
What was the interview process like with Uber?
So I had a call with Ryan. I had a call with Travis. Both those calls went well. They give you the analytics test. They give you the creative test. And and then basically from there, it went straight to an offer. So it was like after Airbnb, where I'd been kind of this on again, off again process for 3 to 6 months, nothing against them, just a different stage they were in different kind of like hiring situation. With Uber, literally took 2 weeks. once like they seemed at that point to put a lot of weight in like those tests they give you. I think the fact that I worked at Goldman and went to Stanford, I think they perhaps a little elitist or a lot elitist, but they certainly put a lot of trust in like the hiring process for those other companies. And, it was super quick.
I mean, something that I talked to Chan about, which I didn't really think about until that conversation, but with launch specifically, which is ultimately what you were hired for. I mean, he said there was probably a 50% hit rate on launchers. It seems like maybe part of the philosophy at that time was smart people, they check the boxes, they're normal. Let's get them in and let's get them launching, and at least we get a market out of it. And if they don't work, it's fine. You're just sort of on to the next one.
Yeah, I remember it a little differently in the sense that I think only like 20 people would pass the analytics test. And I remember them being like exceptionally stubborn about if you could even move on if you didn't pass the analytics test. Like it was like a binary. So I don't remember it being that easy to get people in the door because you get these great candidates and then they wouldn't pass the analytics test. And, what was her name? Not Mina, the other woman. Athena, maybe?
Is she still around? Yeah, Athena.
She was the one who was grading them. So if she would be like, no, it's, because it was a little subjective. But yeah, no, so I don't remember being that easy, but there was this thing where like when I was launching London, he was like, you can't launch Amsterdam until you've hired another launcher. And I was like, we don't even know if this works in London. We only have 10 cars in London. Why do we need to hire like 5 more launchers when like the 2 foreign countries we're in, like we don't even know if it works. And that's the difference between me and Travis and Ryan, right? Like that's why they run the company that's now worth $100 billion and they built it from scratch. Whereas I'm like sitting there being cautious. And these guys are like, no, we need 5 launchers for Europe. Meanwhile, we have like 10 cars in Paris and 10 cars in London. I'm like, that's like a 2 launcher for every car ratio. But they were just so aggressive about you couldn't launch a new city unless you had another launcher. So you could kind of just get that like exponential situation going. It was pretty like their ability to just be so confident in the future of the business, invest so much money and just not give a fuck was kind of incredible.
So you get hired to launch Asia, but it seems like there's quickly a decision that no Asia yet.
I mean, at the time we were in 5 US cities, Toronto and Paris. Like the app kind of couldn't, like, there were so many things about like payments in other currencies, like getting the app in different app stores, like regulatory, anything.
Language.
Yeah, language. Yeah, because Amsterdam, I think, I don't remember if France was in French or not, or if it was just English. But so they were like, maybe we shouldn't do Asia quite yet. So they had me go to London first.
And what was the experience like in London? I mean, you land there. Take me from the beginning. I mean, you're hired. What happens next? Because you're in London relatively early on in your career there, and it's just launched this whole new country.
Yeah, I mean, London was incredible because like that stage of my life, like the last quarter, I broke up with my ex-girlfriend and met my wife, and I left Goldman Sachs and joined Uber. It was like the most positive transition moment anyone could ever have in their entire life. But one of the things is my wife, who was my girlfriend at the time, was living in London. So for me, it was kind of perfect. I would have been probably less happy to go to London, but because of her, I was like, this is great. I moved to London, launched it. When I got there, Ryan, Travis, Curtis, and Paul Holden were all there. They were trying to do like so that was awesome because I got to spend 2 weeks with Paul, Curtis, Ryan and Travis the very first week. And they're like trying to figure out the London situation, we had a competitor there called Halo, and Halo was basically just the same app as we have, but trying to help people flag London taxis. It was run by an American guy, and Travis saw them as like our big kind of Europe competitor at the time. So, we did like research on Halo and competitive research and stuff like that. And then, then it just, to be honest, the launch playbook was pretty written at that point. But, we were just in the high end stuff. So we would go to like the different clubs in London, find the cars that were taking people home and see if they drive on Uber. And I think we had 10. I think we launched with 10 in the whole city.
Were there any regulatory hurdles up front when launching London?
Not really that I remember, but I remember that I was with Ryan in the office and Ryan was like, I'm not sure the regulatory situation. And he tweeted at the head of TfL, like literally just tweeted at him and he responded and Ryan went and did a meeting. But London was interesting because there's a company called Addison Lee that basically did the exact same thing, and it's one of the things I always think about with the tech. Like when I launched London, Addison Lee had basically the same tech, push a button, get a ride. Like it really wasn't Like the UI was probably a little different, but the basic concept wasn't that different. Push button. So they had this whole, they're called mini cabs, and the mini cab industry is huge there. So we just kind of slotted right in, but we had a competitor that was established and basically did the exact same thing we did. And that was literally just Travis being more, Uber was just younger, more interesting, cared more about consumers, cared more about the experience, and that's how we won there. When we launched in Singapore, and this is a year later, they also had the Comfort Del Grow had also an app that was the exact same. Like the tech actually wasn't that novel in two of the countries I launched in. Which I thought was kind of interesting.
Well, but part of that also was the multi-country strategy of once you get it on someone's phone, if they can get a ride anywhere, they really have no reason to leave and download another app.
Yeah, but 90-something% of the rides were locals. I just think at the end of the day, these both Comfort Del Grow is a 30, it's just an old taxi company in Singapore. Addison Lee was quite hated. The founder was always saying bad things about bicyclists and trying to get rid of bike lanes. He was just he kind of had a monopoly on the non-taxi business and just was kind of over caring about consumers and drivers. And then we came in and we're out there giving incentives and trying to do cool new marketing stunts and having trying to hire young, cool influencers in the town to push our product. And it really was almost like a branding thing, that allowed us to, because I don't think our tech was that much different when it comes down to it, versus some of these other guys that were there.
I can't remember how far along it was or if you were still there, but I remember one of the inflection points in London was we did give 20 pounds, get 20 pounds. It was normally give 10, get 10. But when we flipped it to give 20, get 20, it just ripped. And I don't know why, but that number was just the point where it was worth it for people to push out. And then it just went super viral.
Yeah, I kind of shudder when I hear about that because if you would do something like that in China, it would just lead to a bigger fraud business. And the number of people who literally built businesses around defrauding give get in Asia was out of control. And it happened a little bit in the US, but in some of these other countries, you give 20, get 20, you can get hundreds of dollars of free rides. And a lot of these people just refer their kids, they'd create multiple accounts and stuff like that. But this is the super cynic in me just because I think Asia beat it into me. And but there's no question that the referral thing was pretty massive. It was such a huge channel for new users.
So you launched London, you then end up launching Amsterdam. Did you have any concerns at that time of the company's ability to succeed, or was it just kind of off to the races?
I did. We were when I left London, we probably had 20 cars, 50, maybe 30, 40 on at once. You'd look at Godview, there wouldn't be that much out there. People couldn't get rides. Wait times were high from 2 to 6. There'd be no riders, and we were paying hourly to the drivers, 25 pounds an hour, so it started to add up. So I was like, I'm not sure this is working. And it certainly was not a type of thing where you're just wow, this is a dream business model. I would say that actually happened in none of the cities, especially because at that point we were still expensive. We were still more expensive than taxis. The magic just hadn't quite hit by the time I would be in cities for 3 months. And of those 3 months, 2 of them were preparing for the launch. So it was never a thing where you saw what was going on in cities and you're just it was more fuck, we need more riders. Fuck, driver burn's getting pretty high. That was more kind of my concern. But maybe you can tell by now, I'm a bit more of a cautious person. And, I think that would always piss off Ryan because he'd be we're going to be huge. Stop fucking complaining. Stop worrying. And he's right. I was wrong.
How involved was Travis with those early launches in London and Amsterdam?
A lot. He came to London. First of all, he came to London for 2 weeks. Then he came back for the launch. So he came to speak at the launch party. He would go to all the launch parties. So he came to speak at that one. There were things like the pricing calls, for every city had its own pricing kind of metrics. And for every single launch, probably, I don't know the number, but probably for the first 50, to do the pricing, you had to do it with Travis. So you'd have a 3 to 4 hour call where you'd take it, you'd build a presentation, you'd run him through the city. And I still remember the Amsterdam launch one. I remember exactly where we were when we did it with him. And he was such an expert on taxi industry dynamics and on the way kind of like cities tend to operate and the way the taxi industry operates, that he was like giving us a lesson on Amsterdam taxis, even though he knew nothing about Amsterdam taxis. He was just like, he was like, oh, well, this kind of dynamic with limos and taxis is the same as they have in Washington, DC or whatever city. And this is what ends up happening there. So this is probably what your drivers are telling you. And Casper, was kind of one of our local guys was like, yeah, that is actually what taxi drivers are telling us. Like Travis was so in the weeds. It was out of control how smart he was about what we were doing. And it's definitely one of my memories of that time is like, to me, I'm just like, if you're going to be a CEO, you got to know more than like your most junior person about the details.
I mean, so looking back now, I mean, taking that example, how do you think about Travis as an entrepreneur?
I mean, he's insane. Like I remember the weirdest thing about him getting kicked out of the company is that when I was thinking about Uber, and obviously I had so much kind of financial stake in the company, it was it was all of us when we first joined. It was all we cared about. Like our whole Facebook walls were just posting about Uber. Like we lived and breathed the company 24/7. I was just like, the only risk is we lose Travis. I mean, every single person wanted him in the room. Every single person cared at what he thought at all moments. Every person thought that he was the expert on everything. And it's because he was. The first conversation I had with him, I asked if he had a girlfriend at the time. He said, I do. My girlfriend's name is Uber. And every now and then I have a mistress. And it's and it just speaks to how all in this dude was. Like he was just on another level. And I think it's interesting when you look at people who left Uber and went to other companies, everyone was just like, nothing can hang. Nothing can hang with working with that guy. And the only people who didn't say that were the guys who went to Cloud Kitchens and worked with him again. I think there are a handful of that, but he's on and I think it showed the most in that period. I think in those first couple of years, I think as the company got bigger, one of the interesting things about these things is that I think at a company like somebody's where you have kind of like this larger than life founder, is one of the things people care most about is being close to the founder. It's like, whenever there's a meeting, everyone say, oh, was Travis there? Like everyone's just like focused, like on what did Travis say? What did Travis, everyone like cared so much. But inevitably 2 things happen as a company gets bigger. One is you get further from the founder. That's just the way it goes. Like I was the head of Asia expansion and I reported to Austin, or reported to Ryan at first, and I reported to Austin, then I reported to Alan. It's like, that's just the natural evolution. The company gets 20,000 people. You're going to be further from the founder. And the second thing that happens is the founder gets bigger and bigger. He's on Forbes suddenly. He's on Fortune, and I think that a lot of the tension that I saw as the company grew sometimes was people just being like jealous of each other, like that they kind of felt like they were getting further from the sun. That was something I came to terms with very, very early on. So I did not struggle with that much, but that was a bit of a riff.
No. I mean, it's super fascinating. And it is wild. I mean, even now when things come up and they're like, how early were you at Uber? And people will say, oh, did you work with Travis?
People still ask me. People are always like, did you talk to Travis there? I'm like, I haven't spoken to him in 5 years, but he is a fucking king.
The king. And I just relate to all those moments of you being in the room with him. His phone's down, he's locked in, and he's be the last person to leave that room until a problem's solved, and he can go longer than
there is zero BSing with that guy. Like if you think about the other jobs, you're like, oh, I got through that meeting with the CEO and he didn't realize I'm an idiot. Like that does not happen with Travis. Like he just knew more than you did about the stuff you were the expert on. Like it was wild, especially those early days. It was like, and that's why I think if you, that group of people, like the first few hundred employees, kind of broadly speaking, I think share the sentiment.
100%. All right. So then you end up back in Asia. So what happens there? Now it's okay, let's get Asia going. And so naturally you're going to be tapped to move back out there.
Yeah. So after London, they said, do you want to launch Australia or Amsterdam? And because I had my girlfriend in London, I decided to launch Amsterdam. And Australia was kind of under the Asia ideology, or not like thought at that process. Chris Ballard went out and did Australia, hired Rorsheim and Oscar like right away. I went into Amsterdam. That was like 3 or 4 months. And then I went to Singapore. We launched Singapore. We hired Tomas. He came and did Singapore with me. We brought Candace and Chan out there at Cham Park, and they did Korea and Taiwan. So at that point, it started to get a little bit more in full motion. Like we were doing Singapore, we were doing Korea, we were doing Taiwan. We hired Tiger Fang and Ben Chang. They went and, I think that was all this was over the course of next year. They did China. So then at that point, I kind of took on more of a management role, managing some of these launchers. Alan Penn moved out to Asia. So it was pretty amazing how quickly it just spun into okay, we're going to be everywhere.
What was the main difference, especially early on, from the European cities to Asia when you got back there?
Man, I mean, I honestly think of the similarities more. Every city you go to, one thing that sticks out is everyone tells you you're going to fail. And it's always the same. Especially back then when it was higher end, people, you don't know how cheap people in London are. You don't know how cheap Dutch people are. You don't know how cheap Singaporeans are. Every single city said that. You don't understand why the city was different. It was kind of a meme after a while, the extent to which everyone told you that Uber would fail in their city. They would normally talk about some random idiosyncratic thing about their city. By the third launch, it's just everyone says this. And at the end of the day, the similarities that kind of bond the cities I actually found to be much more noteworthy than
the differences.
Yeah.
What are some of the highlights from Singapore?
I'd say the cities I personally launched were London, Amsterdam, Singapore, Shanghai, and Hong Kong. Those are ones where I personally was the core launcher, although Candace actually, I think, was the core launcher in Hong Kong. But the regulatory story there, I love, because the regulators started emailing us and calling us and trying to get us to come talk to them. And Travis was of the view that he had done the research on Singapore regulations, and our business is perfectly legal there. We don't have to go see the regulator. We're following the rules. If we're breaking and everyone was like, no, you have to see the Singapore regulator. We had this guy named Vidit who was terrified. He's like, we got to go in. We can't ignore the government. But one of the memories that sticks with me, we had a offsite in Berlin, and I'm launching Singapore, but we were in Berlin for a week with the launchers. And we got another kind of email from the regulator, and I sent it to Travis, and he was like, ignore it one more time. I want to see what these guys are made of. And it was kind of whatever Travis says goes. We thought that was completely crazy. Then what he ended up doing was he flew, when we ended up meeting him, eventually, you're in their city, you should probably meet him. He flew Corey from Washington, D.C. to Singapore to have that meeting, because his view was if he doesn't want the regulator to think that they can get in touch with the local team. He wants that, he wants the local team to build the business, get big,
stay focused. Regulators scare people. He doesn't want that to happen. So he flew Corey from DC to Singapore to go do that meeting, so our local team didn't have to meet them. And at the end of the day, Singapore is one of the cities we had the least regulatory issues with. So the strategy ended up working fine. I did go to that meeting with Corey, and the person who we were all intimidated by, I think was a 21-year-old intern who had been sending us these emails, who was wearing an Adidas tracksuit and literally just was not the kind of guy that you're oh, this guy is going to come cane me or whatever it is that people intimidating
in Singapore. But it was, that was a bit of an interesting experience.
Yeah. Travis's instincts correct again.
Exactly.
So, I mean, China.
Yeah.
What do I even ask? What do I even say?
So China, when I first got to China, we started in Shanghai, and there are I wasn't there for the China story. The China story was we were fuck it, we're going to beat Didi. And when I say that people tell you you're going to fail when you go to Amsterdam, when you go to Singapore, the level people tell you you're going to fail when you go to China is on another level. It's the locals that tell you you're going to fail in Singapore, in London, in Amsterdam. In China, the entire world tells you you're going to fail. Everyone has a tech story of American companies failing. Travis had a huge chip on his shoulder. I think because of common knowledge, this common wisdom that everyone knows that Americans fail in China, and Americans are so arrogant when they go there, and we don't respect the local culture, and we don't know these subtle differences. He was oh no, we're going to fucking do it. But the story, when we first got there, he and I and Patty Lee, who spoke Chinese, we did meetings with Didi and Kuai Di. Kuai Di was the other competitor, but they were only in Texas at the time. So it was a very pleasant meeting. They were okay, you guys go do high end, and we'll, you do the high end American expats, and we'll get the people. And I was okay. But in the back of his head, he's oh, fuck you. We don't just do high end American expats. We do everybody. That we don't fuck around like that, And someone said who's going to be someone once said in an interview something about the Uber of Malaysia, and his line was the Uber of Malaysia is Uber. He just at that time he just had that approach. But when I worked there full time, It was, again, 20 cars. We were focused more on expats then. Like Paul Holden, who was our iOS engineer, like could go our maps didn't work. There was some like thing where and you should get Paul on to talk about this because it was kind of crazy. But like there was this thing where the map for Google Maps, which is what we were on, basically said you were like 2 miles from where you were. There was something they did to make the app something like non-competitive, like let's mess with the American mapping thing. So they have to use that. Like, so Paul Holden went in and like reverse engineered it and said, take your location and subtract 2 miles, and that's where you actually are. And like that was how we launched in China. But one of my biggest like points of pride and from Uber was that I did give Uber our Chinese name, and that was like very highly. Like it was a very well received. Like the newspapers wrote positively about the Chinese name, so that was kind of cool.
What was the Chinese name?
Yobu. Remember? And Travis named his dog Yobu.
Yes,
Travis and Gabby had that little dog.
Yes.
Yeah. He was all in on China, man. Named his dog after it.
When did things flip and go from? Because I remember that it was Shanghai, it was expats, it was sort of the normal model. But then it flipped into warfare, and then it was China.
It was insane. I mean, one thing I've kind of learned in life is if the data tells you something crazy, it's normally because something's crazy. And I remember like we would have these all hands calls where the China team would be like, and Chengdu did more rides than the entire United States put together. Like maybe it wasn't that, but like Chengdu did more rides in 3 weeks than New York did after 2.5 years. And I'm like, no, they didn't. Like, there's just no fucking way. Like, that's just not how this shit works. And it literally became a thing where you had businesses built. You know, we had these situations where, you know, we would give the riders 2x what the drivers, we'd give the drivers 2x what the riders paid.
All right. So hold on a second. So for the layman, so if this was ChatGPT,
yeah,
like I'm in 3rd grade,
like you're a normal smart person who doesn't understand all this insider jargon I'm talking.
Yes, when my mom listens to this. So what was happening in China?
There was a moment where, and this had happened in other cities. I think it happened in Latin America and stuff like that, where
for sure,
you know, Travis had decided, and Emil, and just the model was that we wanted to be cheaper than everyone else. We were not going to get undercut. And in China, I think you had other guys who were pretty good at undercutting, but to be honest, no one was better at undercutting than we were. And I call it balance sheet warfare. And I don't remember the details because this was 2014, right? It's 2024 and I'm 43 years old. So the memory's starting to jog up. But yeah, like it got to a place where like Didi and Kuaidi both went into peer-to-peer, where anybody could become a driver. We started our own, we called it Renmin Yobu, like the Chinese currency is renminbi, which is like the people's currency. So we did the people's Uber. We launched the people's Uber. And this was just, it got to a point where we were just like, we're going to compete with Didi head to head. And we're going to make it so Uber's so cheap that every local wants to use it. But we also, the problem is if you make it so cheap that every local wants to use it, well, no one's going to want to drive on it because you're making less than a taxi driver. So what we decided to do was we would make it like half the cost of a taxi or 2/3 the cost of a taxi to ride, but we would pay the drivers 50% more than a taxi. So we were adding something like $8 to every trip. So what you ended up getting was, you know, a husband-wife couple. Like the husband would ride, the wife would drive, and then they'd make money on every single trip, courtesy of Uber. We had all these incentive structures. We were giving people like $100 to refer a new driver. What ended up happening? Any new driver who came in to drive, the intern would pretend they were who was checking them in, because you need so many just like young talent, young like workers. The interns that Uber hired to work for our corporate office created promo codes. So any new driver would just use their promo code, and that intern would be making $1,000 a day because they would refer 10 new drivers. Like the amount of fraud that happened, we ended up burning more than $1 billion in a year. And it was hundreds of millions of dollars per quarter, because we were so committed to winning, to not being undercut, to being the cheapest possible option, paying the drivers the most. And what just ended up happening was an entire industry. The husband-wife pairs were one example. But at the end of the day, you actually had businesses that figured out how to like kind of bug into the phones and do fake trips literally just from an office. and that would run tons and tons of fake rides.
And the ride is cheaper, the driver makes more, and so that split just becomes a
every ride
automatic cash machine.
Every ride in a place where median incomes are 4 digits per year. Like it doesn't take a lot of rides to like put you in a good spot.
Did that strategy work?
Emil, I talked to Emil about this afterwards. You know Emil better than I do. He said that it was a game of chicken that could have destroyed the entire company. We were burning billions of dollars. Didi was burning billions of dollars. If they said, well, let's see how long you can do this for. If they probably would have lasted longer than we would have. Because August 2016, we launched August 2014. So this was very, 2 years goes by quick now, but it felt like an eternity then. But yeah, I think it was August 2016, we came to a deal where we would own 25% of Didi and we would leave. But if that hadn't happened and we had gone a few months later, we could have bankrupted the whole company.
And wasn't there stories of when these incentives would turn off, you'd have protests at offices?
It could be. I actually, at the time I was working in Hong Kong. The reason I was deep into this story was because I became the data guy. I was just constantly doing and I was looking at who our biggest referrers were. And I would find stats that 95% of the people who did the give 10, get 10 equivalent never took a second trip. Why? Because they're fake accounts being traded in offices, right? These aren't real people. So I was in Hong Kong, but it was really being deep in our SQL database that kind of allowed me to figure that out.
So going to Hong Kong,
not that I was the only guy who figured it out, but I think I was the most vocal person when we would celebrate every week. We would just, the whole office would be wow, China's so huge. I can't imagine China, something's different in the water over there. I'm no, we're just getting defrauded, people. We're just getting defrauded.
All right. So going back to Hong Kong, you end up getting arrested.
Yeah.
Which still, you have to be one of the only employees, I think, globally to get arrested.
Yeah, maybe 10 or 20 of us. But yeah, so Uber at the time, I don't know what I left Uber in 2018, 2017. So it's been 6 or 7 years. I still own some stock, but I have no connection to the company. But Uber at the time, I think it was pretty black and white illegal. And at that point,
in Hong Kong,
but at that point, we got to a place where we were if there's no enforcement, then we're still going to launch because it was with Lyft. Lyft was illegal in America, and because it was illegal, we didn't launch a peer-to-peer business. We were only doing licensed drivers, and that was what allowed Lyft to grow big and become our biggest competitor and kind of give us a run for our money, even though we had such a head start. Was our fear that that they were illegal, an assumption that they would get enforced, and then suddenly they didn't get enforced, and we had a huge competitor. So by that point, our philosophy was if there's no enforcement, we're going to go into cities, regardless of the letter of the law. And that was actually how it worked in Hong Kong. We launched, Hong Kong has something 30 or 100 total licenses for anyone to give someone a ride for money. That's not a taxi. So basically, if you're going to get paid to give a ride, you have to be a taxi, or you have to be, Barack Obama's private driver on his one visit to Hong Kong. They need to have something so that Lady Gaga can get a ride to her concert, not in a taxi, and still pay for it. But there are 100 of them. So basically every ride from the airport to a hotel that's not in a taxi is illegal. The whole city, and it's known, it's a known illegality, and it's part of the economy. People don't want it to be enforced. It's a symbolic gesture to make it illegal. The problem was we got pretty big. And a year later, people are wait, the letter of the law says they're illegal. And the taxi industry staged a protest at City Hall where they burnt a taxi. They lit a taxi on fire in front of City Hall as a way to protest Uber. And the next day, the police came and arrested 3 of our interns and me. So that was and it was the day before my bachelor party. So I did not go to my bachelor party, unfortunately. I had 15 friends go to Thailand. And to be honest, maybe it's for the better, but yeah, 18 friends, some crazy number of friends, including a few Uber people, went to Bangkok for my bachelor party, and I missed it because I got arrested the day before.
What was going through your head when you got arrested?
I think it was I think at that time it was just pure in Travis we trust. It was Uber just felt invincible. It really did, and I think there was just this sentiment we'll be fine. So especially then, I'd say I was a little bit nervous. but we had a good lawyer, and I never like spent a minute behind bars. Like basically the way it worked was I got fingerprinted, I got mugshots taken. I had to sit in a room with a dude, and like Hong Kong has their, Western police officer, this British dude who questioned me. Our lawyer just said, no matter what they say, just say, I exercise my right to remain silent. That can be your only answer for an hour. So I said that for an hour straight. And interestingly, he arrested me afterwards, which apparently got them into trouble, because apparently you can never, you can't arrest someone because they exercise their right to remain silent. Like that's a right that can't be incriminating. So that was kind of an interest. I learned a little bit about like law through that, but I ended up being on bail for a year, where every 28 days I had to go back to the police office just to make sure that I hadn't like fled or something like that. And they were trying to do an investigation to figure out what they wanted to charge me with. So it was a year of every 28 days I had to go back to the Kowloon police office, check in, and then I could leave. But not only did my bachelor party get canceled, but we didn't do a honeymoon either, because I had to come back from my wedding to make bail.
Sort of the waning years of your time at Uber. Any highlights that kind of stand out?
I mean, we could do this whole thing. Like Asia got big, right? By the time I left Asia, we had like 3,000 people. Like Cham Park, Mike Brown were kind of running it from Singapore. I was in Hong Kong and managing like North Asian markets. But we hired a bunch of really senior people from Google. And I was like, all right, this is like not for me anymore. So that was when I went and became the head of photography, which was like the greatest thing ever, So, I always thought we were bad at like the human story. I always thought like all of our visuals were about like, bits meet atoms, yada, yada, and it just felt very robotic, and we had maps that were freaking cool, but they're like the human part wasn't very well told. So I asked Travis and Shaolin, who came and visited me when I was launching London. So someone I knew very early on. Shaolin was our head of brand. And he was like, he's like, yeah, why don't you come be our head of photography? And that was an awesome job. I like built out a database of photos. Like in Asia, we like our ads would have like white and black people as drivers when there weren't white and black people driving. And so I like built a library of photos. So we had photos from all over the world that could serve any country. We're in 50 countries, so we just needed a lot of assets for that. I did that. I did like the conference room screens where I'd like tell the stories of different drivers every day and put a different quote from the driver on the conference room screen, which probably my favorite project I've ever done in my life. So the photography stuff was awesome.
So looking back, what would you say are kind of 3 core takeaways from being an early employee at Uber?
I mean, one is Travis as having a founder and CEO who knows the business better than anybody, who works 20 hours a day, who lives and breathes the business, who's competitive as hell, who's ruthless as hell, who everyone respects. That was everything. We talked about the tech. In my experience, the tech wasn't that interesting. The interesting thing was Travis's willingness to go play 3D chess, 4D chess, whatever it is with regulators and break into markets that if you would have told me in 2006 that the Paris taxi industry, which has not had a single change since 1945, had a licensing structure that was set up in 1945 to protect the taxi industry. If you would have told me that and any effort to disrupt it didn't even get to first base. If you'd have told me this would completely fall on its knees, protest with fires on the street, and the prime minister involved, and it would happen because of a college dropout who lives in California and doesn't speak a word of French, I would have told you were fucking crazy. And he did that in 2 years. That was absolutely mad. So I'd say like for me, that just like, I kind of like continue to be in awe of that impact that he was able to force. And I guess another thing is like how religious is the wrong word, but how we were all so obsessed with the business. And I think of you all the time with this. Like, I don't know if this is true, but I have this picture of you going into a Starbucks and not leaving until every single person had a promo code for a free ride on an Uber. Like all of our Facebook walls became totally devoted to Uber. There was just something about it that I think we got obsessed with. And then a word I use a lot is leaderboard culture. Like, we had leaderboard on our like weekly stats, right? Like every 5 minutes, there was I'll start over. Every 5 minutes, we had a site that was called Leaderboard that said exactly how many rides Boston, New York, every single city had done. how much revenue every single city had done, how many drivers had driven in every single city. And every 5 minutes, you'd get the new 5 minutes and you'd remove a week ago 5 minutes. So every 5 minutes, you got to see, did you outpace that exact 5-minute stretch that you had a week ago versus now? And there was something about the dopamine hit, the gamification of it, the competitiveness of it, that like the teams got competitive with each other while still being collaborative. There's something about like this measurability of Uber, and the companies I've been at since have not had that. Everywhere I go, I'm like, what is the leaderboard here? What is the number that if I make higher, I have succeeded? And it's kind of one of the reasons why when there are all these culture issues at Uber, like we became like the poster child for bad culture. And the culture I experienced at Uber was leaderboard culture, which was literally just totally obsessed with numbers. And it didn't, and I think that like it didn't matter, our head of Macau was a woman. A lot of our senior people in Asia were women. Like no one cared what gender because in those markets, you were all about the leaderboard. You're all about competing with taxis. You're all about competing with regulators. You're all about winning in those markets. And I think to the extent that there were culture issues, it was very San Francisco. It was much more kind of US centric, but where I was, leaderboard culture dominated everything. And it was awesome. It was tons of fun.
I mean, collaborative, but competitive was totally how those city teams were. And it was because everybody wanted the overall business to succeed, but you also wanted to look good and win in the process.
Yeah, I was thinking of like DC versus New York, and like, it's like, or versus Boston or whatever, and like trying to keep the ratio higher or whatever it was until like Josh just ran off with everything. And those GMs like did feel like they were competitive, but like you get together and everybody is, family is the wrong word, but everyone's like super tight,
Yeah, and sharing best insights and best ideas and whatever else.
Yeah.
So tell me about life after Uber, because I think, one of the themes that I'm seeing a bit throughout this podcast thus far is people chasing the high a bit. And so you're on, kind of once in a lifetime experience in some ways. What has been that sort of post Uber for you?
You can't replicate it, and you try and you fail. And like I said, I've said Travis's name too many times, but it's like, you go to these other companies and you're like, wait, where's the guy who everyone's blown away by? Where's the leaderboard where's every single employee talking about this nonstop to the extent that their family hates them? Like, I thought that's what happens at startups, but it was just like, that was very, very hard to find. When I first left, I went into crypto, thinking it was a total bust. Like I worked in the industry for like 6 months, and like after working at a place I believed in, and I went to all these conferences in crypto, and I was like, I don't believe a word any of these people are saying. This is the phoniest shit I've ever seen. This is like 2017, 2018, which was a crypto boom at the time. So I did that, got out quick, kind of went through a couple of years where I did like, I got a degree in counseling and executive coaching. So I kind of got really into coaching. I was still living in Hong Kong. COVID hit. I always say like it was a period of unsuccessful soul searching. Still didn't find it, but I got really into the coaching work. And I did think that the experience at Uber and Goldman Sachs was pretty helpful for that. But then we moved to the US, moved to Colorado. And within 6 months of moving to the US, I got into NFTs and like kind of went back into crypto. I liked the NFT use case, and I started to become like a data analyst just talking about NFT prices. And I built a Twitter account. My Twitter account has over 100,000 followers. And I post mainly data analytics, although now I just kind of shit post a little bit more about crypto and NFTs. I work for a company now in Hong Kong. And I've kind of like built this like online persona. That's my like profile picture is like female punk. But then I started doing a YouTube show. So I worked for Kevin Rose. That was my first boss. Kevin Rose he started Dig, and, like for Alexis Ohanian was an investor in our company, in NFTs. And for him, I built like a daily YouTube show that did daily analysis. I created about 300 of those. So kind of just become like an online NFT crypto analytics person, which I like. And I got 3 kids. I live in the mountains. I've gotten into hockey. Like,
it's a good life.
This is actually, I like life is good. I'm not going to lie. Like life is pretty damn good, but it was hard for a couple of years to like, you had the money, I had the wife and kids. Like I've got a great family. I had the money, like it's kind of everything you want, but I didn't have a sense of mission. And it wasn't a big deal. Like some people have big issues. That was not a big issue, but it was certainly like the thing I was struggling with afterwards.
All right, a fun one to end with. What's an interesting piece of content that you've consumed that you want to share?
Content about what?
Anything.
Hold on. 3 videos. Let's go 3 videos, all Jason Calacanis themed. Okay. We're going to go 3 videos, all Jason Calacanis themed. Okay. The first one, when I told you when I first got the job at Uber, I went out for a drink with my friend who was like, we should bring Uber to Hong Kong. I was like, you've heard of it? I went home and I Googled Travis, and he had done an interview with Jason Calacanis in August of 2021, where
2011.
I'm 43, dude. I suck at everything. Yeah. 2011.
That was also, that video was also hugely impactful on me, because it was like at the end of it, he goes, we're going to Chicago. And I was like, let's fucking go. We're going to Chicago, baby.
That video is so insane because, so I ran the data analytics afterwards. I went into the SQL database. I said, on the date of this interview, how big was Uber? Uber was doing less than 1,000 rides a week globally. We were doing less than 1,000 rides per week.
It was just San Francisco and New York.
It was just San Francisco and New York. And we were doing fewer rides than probably like Fresno does today. Like Fresno is bigger now than the whole global business was then. And he was sitting there telling Jason straight in the eye, we are going to be bigger than taxis. And I was like, this dude fucking crazy. And he believed it. And
everyone's going to be, and by the way, everyone's going to be a driver, which was a crazy thought at that time. Because Uber X is ride sharing is years away.
Totally. So I'm sitting there thinking, this guy's fucking psycho, but I'll work for him. Because you kind of want to work for the psycho guys. Like you have to have thick skin, but if you check that box and you're like, I know that I'm going to get attacked a little bit, like you're going to be in for a fucking ride. We're going to be bearing taxis. We have a business that's globally, that's smaller than Fresno is at the time, smaller than like probably 1/10 of what Austin is right now. The vision for this to be massive that he had when the evidence like was pretty meager was wild. So that interview, I still like am blown away by the confidence he had. Like, cause I know what it's like to be in an 800 ride a week city. I know what that's like. And the last thing you think is like, you're thinking,
we're gonna
holy
win.
Fuck, my drivers are pissed because they got no rides at 3 p.m. And like that, and he's sitting there thinking, we're going to dethrone the entire fucking industry. Like that interview, looking back is wild. The second video is the Jason Calacanis, I was early to Uber video on VC Brags. Have you seen it, Max?
No.
Oh, you have to see it. This video is so funny. It's just so good. Like I've never met Jason. I feel like I know Jason a little bit because that interview was so impactful for shifting my life's direction. And like I like had it in like I still remember the song I was listening to the morning of that interview. Like when you have impactful moments in your life, you just kind of remember. And so Jason has had, but this VC Brags video, everyone should go Google like VC Brags, Jason Calacanis, early Uber investor. It's hilarious. And then the other one is Jason Calacanis' last interview with Uber with Travis.
Yeah.
You know, Travis went 6 years without doing a single piece of content. He did not do a single piece of content. Like, I think he had people who work for Cloud Kitchens couldn't put it in their LinkedIn. And he told me that Uber was his wife or girlfriend. Everyone else was a mistress. And then then the wife, the girlfriend, the baby, whatever it is, literally just got forcibly removed from his hand. And the extent to which that was heartbreaking for everybody who really knew what this dude was about and how close he was to the company was like, it was heartbreaking. It was honestly like Hong Kong has politics, like China versus anti-China. US obviously has politics, like right versus left. And there got to a place where Uber had politics, like loyalist versus not trust. But I was such a deep loyalist. And I was like, all you guys who are sitting there upset about something that happened at a level 3 tiers away from this guy or whatever it was. And some of the things weren't great and he had his flaws, but like, this is his company and he's not a bad person. You know, he really, but going back to the content, when Jason said like, how did you get kicked out? And he goes, first they did a 6-month media campaign against me, which is true. Like during that period, every other week I'd get a push alert from the New York Times about something one of my friends did because he worked at Uber and it became national news. Like they came after us so aggressively. And he was like, and that was fine. And then one of my parents died suddenly in a boat accident. And 2 weeks later, they showed up at my hotel room and told me I had to step down and I couldn't hang. And here's someone like that who is so confident, such a like alpha person in life to just say like so vulnerably, like I couldn't hang. Like that to me was a strong line in there. And again, I don't think the guy's perfect, but that hit me pretty hard.
Oh yeah. No, he's the best. And I'm with you. And a lot of our old guard, once he was done, we didn't last very long because we knew it just wasn't the same thing.
I could have lasted, honestly. I think I had a couple more years in me if I wanted it. But why would I want to do that would be like going back to Goldman Sachs. At that point, you're working for a 23,000 person company. And the thing, and I think like guys like Andrew McDonald, who's still there and was our original general manager. This is the other thing, kind of going back to things I learned there. It was amazing how all the senior people, until Dara, who proved this wrong, but before him, all the senior people who survived were like people who started at the ground level. Andrew McDonald was the general manager for Toronto. Pierre was the general manager for Paris to start. And those two guys, I think, became are still two of the top 3 or 4 guys. Whereas we brought in Case Colin from Booking. He was the CEO of Booking.com. Simon Breakwell, who was the founder of Expedia. A lot of these like really experienced guys who didn't have that on the ground experience with Uber, like lasted 6 months. And they were great dudes. I loved working for all these guys. There's a guy named Neil Wace who had a online gambling company that became a $5 billion public company. All these guys lasted 6 months. And it was the guys who were on the ground, like learning the ins and outs of the culture and the business that like stuck around forever, except for most of us.
Absolutely. All right, Sam, really appreciate this. This was awesome. And I think people are going to enjoy it. So thank you so much for joining.
Always fun to talk to you, Max. Appreciate it.
All right.